So I don't need to use a microphone. Welcome to the Asona Centre. I say that because we as Bradwell Bay Preservation Group are guests of the Asona Centre. But welcome to the Bradwell Bay Preservation Society. We are trying to preserve as much as we can of the old airfield. And if we can't restore or save a lot of physical stuff, we are very interested in saving all the memories and archives and collating them in a way that can be useful to people in the village and to wider historians. Taking a very holistic approach to it. You know, it's not just about this Spitfire had massive great guns. I couldn't tell you that sort of technical stuff, but we are interested in the human side of it, in having talks about people, how it affected the village, etc. So we're trying to preserve the whole picture rather than just the technical stuff. Okay, just quick health and safety. Toilets are just behind the canteen, or just behind the kitchen on your right hand side. Please don't use the kitchen behind. And if a fire alarm goes off, go to your nearest fire exit and gather out on the grass there, and we'll make sure you're all accounted for. And that's about all the health and safety stuff. Please nobody walk along here because I've got wires and all that sort of thing. Not so much that I'm worried about you hurting yourself, but you might smash your projector. Sorry. Right, can I introduce Stephen Nunn, local historian, writes a column in the Malden and Burnham Standard. I haven't read this week's one yet. Stephen's been researching Bradwell Bay for a couple of years, isn't it? A few years, yeah, man and boy. He's also a local councillor. So
not today, I'm not.
Not today, no. He's here as part of Bradwell Bay. He's actually, Stephen is patron to the Bradwell Bay Preservation Society. And you see that's our logo. So Stephen's going to talk about Malden at war and give us an interesting insight into that. After that there'll be Angie. What's your surname, Angie?
Pavry.
Oh, it is Pavry, right. I didn't like to assume. Right, so we've got Angie Pavry talking about George Powell Shedden, I miss out the complicated bits, who was a station commander at Bradwell for a short while, but we're going to talk about his whole career, which is quite an interesting one. And then we get lunch. Lunch is provided here, so you get a break from us. And then after lunch, I'm afraid you've got to listen to me giving you a talk on the last commander at Bradwell Bay, who only lived till he was 44, but lived quite an interesting life. And the interesting thing about him, he had very strong connections with Douglas Bader. So we've got a bit of a Bader theme, which came about by chance rather than planning, I must say. But it's quite an interesting part. So, hope you enjoyed your day. If you think it's absolutely rubbish or anything, let us know. I haven't done any of these. You know, you go on a talk or something, you always have to fill in this evaluation form. I was going to do that for you. But if you've got any strong complaints, or even better, telling us how much you enjoy it, that myself, Jean or Alison know afterwards. So, let me hand over to Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, and good morning, everyone. Really good to see you this morning. Can I start off really by saying how privileged I feel to be here, to be able to open the session today with this talk. RAF Bradwell Bay was and still is a really special historic place. and in a short space of time the Bradwell Bay Preservation Group have done an awful lot to bring that heritage to people's attention. I mean, I know a lot of us knew things about the aerodrome, but they're really coordinating all of that, and I've nothing but praise for the hard work that's been put in by Eric and by the two Pauls and Jean and Alison, and also all of you, the supporters of Bradwell, RAF Bradwell Bay, and I hope the numbers keep growing. So we need to keep the message high on the agenda because of everything that's going on or planned to go on in Bradwell, and we mustn't lose the memory, we mustn't lose that heritage of Bradwell. We're also very fortunate to have some VIPs with us today. We've got the Deputy Mayor of Malden. He's been allowed to cross the border, so good to see you, Andrew, and good to see Angela as well. And we'll hear more about Angela later on because she's going to talk about her father, who I was just telling her I met in 1976, I think it was, here at Bradwell. And a special thanks to the Oath Owner community, of course, for their support today. So in this first slot, I want to kind of upset the rules a bit, really, by not talking much about Bradwell. I will incorporate something about Bradwell, but I wanted to set the scene about the war, really, about the Second World War and what was happening in this area during the Second World War, particularly on the home front, but also aviation, aerial warfare. And to do all of that, I've decided to concentrate on my hometown, Andrew's hometown, Malden, so we can look at what was going on in Malden during the Second World War. So the subject really of this talk is based on this book, which is a book that I wrote many years ago about crashes, aircraft crashes across the Malden district. And I'm pleased to say that when that came out, I didn't think anyone would be interested because I thought it was a bit niche, but 1,000 copies sort of sold more or less straight away. And I think that gives some indication of the interest that there is in aviation history and the Second World War, and there continues to be. So this story really is all about Malden and the Dengie during wartime. What was happening in the skies, what was happening on the ground. So I've moved the clock back to those war years of 1939-45, and in particular been looking at the home front. The home front viewed through events in Malden, the impact and activities of local people, the civil defence services, and the war in the air, and across the town and across the Dengie. You've got sheets of paper there. That's not homework. That's just a handout for you, which summarises the civil defence services in Malden at the time. And when I look at this, I think that the Malden of the Second World War was a Malden of sandbags, of shelters, of warfare in the skies, but above all, it was a Malden of spirit. It was a Malden of happiness. Yes, of course, it was tinged occasionally with sadness, but it was all part of a crucial chapter in the national and local story. And it was, if I had to summarise Malden at that stage with a picture, it would be that. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn that that's a made-up picture. Otherwise, the skipper probably would have had kittens. But it gives you the impression. It's a Malden of barges and bombers. It's a Malden that still had Victorian roots, and the barges were still active. They were transporting essentials. And suddenly, the silence of the sails and the sailing, that silence was broken by aircraft sounds. So that for me is Malden. It's a bombers and barges kind of thing. Now, contrary to how I might look, I wasn't actually around during the Second World War, but my late father was. And this is Dad. Unfortunately, Dad's not with us anymore, but this is Peter, and he was born in 1931. So he spent all of his schoolboy years growing up in Malden. And during my later school days, when I went to All Saints Primary at Malden and then the Plume, I began to develop an interest in the local story and Malden's history, and that was encouraged by a couple of my teachers. Everybody else was reading about Chiang Kai-shek's China and Lenin's Russia, because that was part of the curriculum. It bored me completely, so I turned to local studies, and as a result didn't end up with any qualifications, but do have an interest in a deep interest in local history. So when Dad was around during the Second World War, I used to talk to him about his memories from that time. And he spoke about the home front, he spoke about the local services and the fear and the hardship, but also the fun and camaraderie. And he spoke about aerial dogfights in the skies above his house where they lived at Munden Road. And what seemed to me to be a very far-fetched number of aircraft crashes. But I realised as I started to do my research that Dad had only really kind of scraped the surface. But his aim as a schoolboy, along with an army of other schoolboys, was to get to these aircraft crashes before anybody else, before the Home Defence Services, and to try and get some souvenirs. Now, Dad wouldn't have been interested in these bits, because these are just kind of scraps of aluminium from from an excavation that was post-war of an aircraft, a wartime aircraft crash. They were after richer pickings, and to illustrate that, he went to Malden Council School, and one day the police turned up in the classroom and said, right, okay lads, who's got the Luger? Because one of them had got to a Messerschmitt 110 at Munden and had pinched a Luger from the aircraft, and somebody duly handed it back. Different times, weren't they? So I began to record Dad's memories about those aircraft crashes, and all these years later I'm still doing it, and if my wife was here she'd say yes he is, because there's like files everywhere at home of eyewitness accounts and all sorts of things. So I interviewed people that remember these aircraft crashing, local people. I was privileged to be able to interview some of the surviving aircrew, both Allied and enemy. And those interviews were then complemented with material gleaned from official archives, from the Essex Record Office and what was the Public Record Office, now National Archives, isn't it?
That's it, yeah, the National Archives at Kew.
So I hope you'll agree that the picture that's emerged, taking all of that stuff together, is of interest. It shows how one small riverside town was affected by the conflict. Malden and the Dengie might not have suffered in the same way that other places did, I mean nowhere near as much as London for example, but it definitely was touched by the war, and of course so were its people. So come with me then on this journey back to the war and Malden. What was Malden like when the war clouds began to be formed over Europe? Well, for a start, it was a much smaller place geographically and in sense that lasted long after the Second World War. Everybody knew everybody else's business. It took ages to walk along the high street because you had to stop and talk to everybody. And I remember that with my maternal grandmother. You know, as a young lad, I'd go shopping with her, and it would take absolutely ages. And we'd walk up the high street, and she'd stop and talk to everybody, and she'd come out with these bizarre things. So she'd talk to an old lady for a long time, and then we'd walk on, and she'd say, "Funny old girl, she never did pay her milk bill." And stuff like that, and you think, how do you know that? And actually, why? Who cares? But that's what it was like. Everybody knew everybody else. There were key local names in Malden at that stage, names like the Wrights and the Claydons and the Pitts. These weren't wealthy people, these were the backbone of the town. They were part of the fishing community. And the river was still a really busy place. So it was busy with its fleet of barges, transporting essentials to and from Malden, and even more important, of course, during the war years, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on as we go. Also smacks, fishing smacks. They were still fishing the river. There was still plenty of fish to be had, and of course, as a result, the fishing community didn't suffer really in terms of food. You know, they were pretty well off in terms of the fruits of the river. When I talk about barges and smacks, of course, the barges were pressed into service, commandeered for the evacuation at Dunkirk. And one of those barges that really epitomises it for me is a barge called Glenway. She's in a sorry state now at Mayland, but in her day she was commandeered in May, June 1940 and towed over to Dunkirk, not sailed, towed by a tug, full of armaments and water and medicines. And she was dumped on the beach on the basis that she'd just be left there and blown up, like many of them were. But a very brave naval officer called Hugo de Hamel happened to be on the beach, and he said, I sail in my spare time, and if the sails are all on that barge, I'll sail it back to England. And that's what he did. He got on board, and they got 200 wounded artillerymen on board the barge, and he sailed the barge back to England. He got back to Dover. 20 of the soldiers died of their wounds on the way back, but he made it. And he was never officially decorated for that in any shape or form. And now, of course, he's gone, he's dead. But his widow, a few years ago, came back to Malden and went on board Glenway, which was a very emotional moment indeed, as you can imagine. So in many ways, I think of Malden as having that kind of Dad's Army, Warmington-on-Sea kind of feel about it. The town had been exposed to war many times before. You could say right back to 991, to the Battle of Malden with the Vikings. It had even experienced... Why are you laughing about that? Is it about the battle site?
Just obsessed with Vikings.
Oh, you're so obsessed with Vikings, right? No, there's a lot of controversy about the battle site and where it really took place. But I'm not here to talk about that today, so or council stuff either. So you could say it was back to 991, but actually the town had even suffered aerial attacks before. So during the First World War, there was a Zeppelin raid. And these Zeppelins came over, and this particular Zeppelin, in April 1915, dropped bombs on Malden and destroyed Arthur Smith's workshop in Spittal Road. I'm sure that wasn't their strategic objective, but that's what happened. So then in 1939 it all started again. Can you imagine what those older people in Malden must have felt, having lived through this kind of experience, and then suddenly realised that it was all going to kick off again. Now, as in the First World War, many local people joined the services to go and do their bit for king and country, to go and fight abroad. But so did the people who stayed behind. And I want us to look at those home defence services which are listed on your document. So let's start off with the Home Guard. So there's the top picture there, that's Malden. That's Malden's Home Guard. No, it isn't really. So we're all familiar with Captain Mannering, aren't we, and the Warmington-on-Sea platoon. Dad's Army, televised, would you believe, back from all the way back to 1968 to 1977. Doesn't seem that long ago, does it? But Dad's Army, and in many respects, what I discovered when I looked at Malden's Home Guard is that Dad's Army is a true representation, really, in many ways. It's a representation of resilience, of determination, and a real keenness for locals to do their bit. Malden's Home Guard consisted of A Company. This is part of Malden's Home Guard at the bottom here. A Company of the 2nd Essex Battalion, and it had 6 platoons. And think about these figures, 8,000 people in Malden, some of them have gone off to fight, and with the Home Guard there were 745 members in Malden alone. And they're not alone. We'll add these figures as we go along. they had their battle headquarters here at 21 Silver Street, and initially they had a very motley collection of rifles and machine guns and mortars. They even had their own transport. They had a van, but it wasn't Jonesy's van. They requisitioned the van from the Co-op. So you see, Dad's Army is pretty true to the reality. Battalion bases were spread across the town. There was one base in High Street, one in Tenterfield Road, one at Oakwood House, and one in Haybridge. And the theory behind that spread was that if there was an air raid, they wouldn't all be wiped out. There would be some survivors. Much more difficult to research is the kind of secret branch of the Home Defence Service, the so-called auxiliaries. But we do know that they had at least one hideout in the ruins of Beeley Mill. So Beeley Mill had been destroyed by a mighty fire back in 1875, and all that was left was the brick part at the bottom. The rest of it was all wooden, you see. And this building here is the pump room, the engine house. And I interviewed ages ago an old boy who was an auxiliar, and many of them wouldn't talk. They wouldn't admit that they were auxiliaries. These were going to be the last resistance. They were going to be an underground movement that would fight to the death if the Nazis actually arrived. And I interviewed this chap, and he said, I suppose you found our secret hideout in the ruins of Beeley Mill. And I thought, this all sounds a little bit far-fetched. But he said, if you dig in the foundations of the meal room, so the meal room was kind of like in this area, you'll find a hatch. And that's where we used to keep our armaments. So we got permission to excavate, scrape the top surface off. Sure enough, there was a stone slab. And when we lifted the slab, there was a room underneath. And when we went into the room, there was a single live round of .303 ammunition. So it was true. And he was telling the truth. Also with their headquarters at 21 Silver Street were the local personnel of the ARP. Now there were 612 of those. So add that to the Home Guard. The ARP had 20 sectors, and they had a number of fixed first aid posts. The St Peter's fixed first aid post and the light mobile unit was at St Peter's Hospital. So I'm sure you know this place. And this building played a special part during the Second World War. So the workhouse originally of 1873 that then became the hospital, and the chapel there was used as a mortuary for killed aircrew during the Second World War. But it was also the base of this ARP unit. So there are those windows from that building that we just looked at, the chapel, and you can see the windows again in this picture at the bottom with the ARP standing in front. And this is the mobile unit here. And it included my own maternal grandfather. Can you guess which one he is? He's the shortest one. Yeah. So the little chap at the front was my grandfather, and sadly he was killed in an air raid on Malden at King George's Place in the High Street in 1944. Nowadays, Malden boasts, and we're very lucky to have it, a state-of-the-art modern fire station. During the war years, things were quite different. The old Borough Fire Brigade, which had been formed in 1874, was brought together with the National Fire Service, and we ended up with the NFS and the AFS, the Auxiliary Fire Service. Malden was number 11 area, Division D, number 5 subdivision, and had a complement, strangely, of only 65 personnel, which seems quite low. They had two stations. They had Y Station in Wants Road and Z Station in London Road. Here's 5 of those fairly tired-looking firemen, blackened, wearing their tin helmets, including my own uncle. Can you guess which one he is? Yes, he's the little one at the front. Yeah. There's a pattern developing here, isn't there? This Stanley South. And I remember Uncle Stan as a lovely old boy, had terrible asthma as a result of his wartime experiences with the smoke and everything else, but that didn't stop him going to the Ship and Anchor pub on a Friday night and standing on the table and singing Danny Boy. So he was full of spirit, and the war years had effectively killed in a Boston on the Dengie Marshes, and he's now on Tiptrary's War Memorial because he was a Tiptrary lad. People look at his name, C.A. Hull, and they think, oh, he must have been an older man who was killed in France or some on a foreign field, but actually he was a 17-year-old lad who was killed here at Bradwell in a Boston. Also within the defence structure we had 14 regular and 54 special police, which is a darn sight more than we've got around here at the moment, but there you are. And 21 members of the Observer Corps, the British Red Cross, and many more. Everybody was doing their bit. The grammar school magazine called The Maldonian, and I've got a complete run of this magazine from the 19th century through to the 1960s. And my wife would moan if she was here, she heard that, because they just gather dust. But the magazine, The Maldonian, is brilliant. It's brilliant for the war years because it contains loads of really good information, poignant information about the war, seen through the eyes of young people. So the summer of 1941 editions with last year, when our magazine appeared, many of us wondered if the school would survive. The word invasion haunted us, hammering on the corridors and on the baffle walls.
Our next speaker is Angie Havery, and going to talk about her father, who was station commander at Bradwell, but the talk's going to be about his career because he's had quite a remarkable career. So I'll hand over to Andy. You've got your clicker, haven't you? Okay, thank you. We're very honoured to have you here.
Well, I'm very pleased. Well, first of all, I'm not sure I can follow Stephen's extremely good talk earlier, so have to bear with me. I'm not experienced at this.
Don't worry.
Anyway,
It's a story.
Thank you so much for inviting me today to talk about my father, who was commanding officer of RAF Bradwell from the 24th of May to the 10th of July, 1944. It was a relatively short period, but I know he made many friends during this time here, and he met my godfather, John Cyril Watts, who lived in Bradwell. Today is very close to the 81st anniversary of the most important day of the Battle of Britain, which was September the 15th, 1940. It was the day my father was shot down, and he always called it his second birthday, as he survived. Otherwise, I would not be here today. It is therefore appropriate that I should give a very brief talk about his career in the RAF. My father was one of the few, and was one of the Allied aces with 7 enemy aircraft destroyed to his credit. He was born on April Fool's Day, 1916, at Spring Hill, East Cowes. His father was Colonel Richmond Folliott-Powell, who served in the First World War in the Royal Artillery. From a very early age, my father had a pronounced stammer. It is sobering to remember that he was only 24 at the height of the Battle of Britain in 1940. He was educated at Wellington and was in the school rugby and boxing teams. After Wellington, he started by following the family tradition of going into the army and went to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, but then decided that flying was going to be more challenging and went to Cranwell. We have the report for his time at Cranwell, where he said to have exceptional ability as a leader, and won his colours for rugby, squash, swimming, boxing. For boxing he won a glass and silver ashtray, which I have, but lost his front teeth in the process. His conduct was exemplary, and the closing general remarks were, "He has worked hard and conscientiously, a very strong personality, an exceptionally good leader. He has done exceptionally well, is an all-round sportsman, who succeeds in infecting the other members of teams with his own keenness and enthusiasm." I'm lucky enough to have his original logbook, which chart his flying career in the RAF from start to finish. They represent an important historical record which we have here today. The first of these covers his time at Cranwell and shows the different types of aircraft he trained on, which were mainly biplanes. His assessment as a pilot was average ability as a pilot, flies with confidence and lands well. He's inclined to overshoot, but apart from this, has no outstanding faults. The logbook also covers his first posting in January 1937 to 47 Bomber Squadron in Khartoum as a flying officer, and he flew a variety of planes. This picture is of a Victor's Vincent bomber, which was one of the planes he flew. He was assessed as above average as a light bomber pilot. In May 1939, he was transferred to number 33 Squadron, a fighter squadron equipped with Gloucester Gladiators for policing Palestine, and was officer commanding B Flight. In June 1940, he was posted to the UK, and on June the 17th, he had his first solo flight in a Hurricane. He married my mother in June 1940 at Winthorpe near Newark. My mother had been a VAD nurse at Cranwell, but they had known each other since childhood. Sadly, his best man, Flight Lieutenant Jackson, was subsequently killed in action. My father said that on one occasion he was having a cup of coffee with a friend. They were scrambled, and on return the coffee was still there, but the friend did not return. Life for fighter pilots was very brutish and short. The major event for June was being posted to Douglas Bader's 242 Squadron at RAF Coltishall on June 25th. As quoted in Reach for the Sky, Bader had asked Group for their two best flight commanders. They recommended my father as a very good type, but handicapped by a pronounced stutter. Bader exploded. Stutters, that's no damn good to me. What's going to happen over the radio in flight? Told that Paul Shedden was a Cranwell man, Bader changed his mind. Just the chap, he agreed. Send him along. My father never actually stammered in the air. Must have been the adrenaline of combat. 242 Squadron flew Hurricanes, and my father is believed to have shot down at least 4 enemy aircraft. The logbook is signed in several places by Douglas Bader and shows his daily actions. September the 15th, 1940 was the big day, and he was flying from Duxford. The logbook for that day quotes, "Flying Hurricane V6578 had caught a share in Junkers 88, destroyed. Flying P2884 shot down Junker 88, which went down in a tight spiral." A few minutes after he had shot down the Junkers 88, he was shot down by a Messerschmitt 109. He bailed out and landed with a dislocated shoulder near Rye. This was the most crucial moment of his life, and he was saved by not wearing RAF boots. I would like to read to you what he wrote about this in later life. "I was Douglas Bader, the Legless Wonder, Flight Commander 242 Squadron, one of 2, from the beginning of July until I was shot down in September 15, 1940. I bailed out and got caught in the hood, and I thought it was curtains. Then my shoe came off. In the battles ahead, I never wore the warm RAF aircrew boots. I came free at about 1,500 feet. Fortunately, it was my left arm which was dislocated, so I could pull the ripcord with my right arm, and so I was going to land in a square of high-tension cables. I tried to steer my fall. I hit the ground in pain. I had landed near Rye in Sussex, having taken off with the Bader wing from Duxford near Cambridge, and chased a group of German bombers. I think I got one and damaged others. The siege of Malta was much worse. It was hell. I was also in the Battle of France and Germany flying Mosquitoes, night fighters, with Bob Stainton, George. He always embellished this story by saying that he had to use some very agricultural language with the farmer who came to rescue him to convince him that he was not German. We have the telegram sent to my mother and the transcript of a telephone call advising her of his crash. We also have a letter from someone who found the nose cone of P2884 with oak leaves squashed from impact. Sadly, these leaves have disappeared, but we have a photograph of them and other material recovered from the plane. Apparently my grandmother's comment on his being shot down was, "I always knew George would bounce." My father continued to get Christmas cards from the farmer for many years, asking him to visit, but please don't fall from the sky. He survived, otherwise I would not be here. He also told me that pilots were supposed to shoot enemy pilots, who bailed out to stop them flying again. But there was an unwritten code on both sides that they never did. Their greatest fear was being burnt or landing in the sea, where the chances of rescue were very slim. In one verbal anecdote from the Battle of Britain, he couldn't understand why his Hurricane wasn't flying straight, until the ground crew sergeant pointed out that he had been flying with half a dornier wrapped round his tailplane. In November 1940, he was posted to 258 Squadron under Squadron Leader Clouston, who was a New Zealander and became a close family friend. In April 1941, he was promoted to Flight Commander and posted to command 615 Squadron flying Hurricanes. It is sobering to remember that at least 60% of all enemy aircraft shot down in the Battle of Britain were shot down by Hurricanes. In July 1941, he was posted to Malta to form and command the Malta Night Fighter Unit. This was formed to combat the Italian bombing raids, which were increasingly being carried out at night. The squadron was stationed in Tikali Airport, which, incidentally, my husband and I visited a few years ago. The runway now is a car park for the stadium. My father introduced the practice of hunting in pairs with searchlights and had very successful results against Italian bombers. He also had all his planes painted black to improve their camouflage against the night sky. When on standby, they were billeted in camp beds on the runway, but otherwise HQ was in some luxury in the Palace of Medina, which has been requisitioned by the RAF. From the roof, they could see all over the island. It is now a luxury hotel. James Holland, in his book Fortress Malta, says that my father wanted a team of pilots who would get on well, who liked their drink and knew how to have a good time when off duty. Sounds like my father. He was promoted squadron leader in September 1941. He was also awarded the DFC. We have the full citation here, and it concludes by saying, "By his great and energetic organizing ability, together with his courage and initiative in the air, Squadron Leader Paul Shenton has contributed materially to the successes obtained. He has destroyed at least 5 enemy aircraft, 3 of which were in the Battle of Britain." My father always said that the siege of Malta was absolute hell. He said that the bravest man in his squadron was a steamroller driver who had to flatten the runway after a bombing raid and roll supposedly defused bombs into the runway. My father used to walk beside the steamroller to show that he wouldn't expect the driver to do anything he wouldn't do himself. The Italians dropped a lot of dummy bombs, and my father got it wrong when they dropped bombs with fins revolving. He told his men to put them all in the pit as they were dummies. But when the last one went in, they all exploded. The number of revolutions of the Finns had set the timing. On March the 20th, 1942, a total of 296 tons of bombs were dropped on Tikali airfield, the size of a small English village, smaller than Bradwell, which then looked like the surface of the moon. This compares with 260 tons of bombs which destroyed the whole of the city of Coventry on the night of the 14th of November 1940. Field Marshal Kesselring, head of the Luftwaffe, determined to destroy Malta because of the strategic importance for the Allies in support of their North Africa campaigns. An interesting statistic is that during April 1942, 1 month alone, 6,726 tons of bombs were dropped on Malta, compared with the approximately 18,000 tons dropped on the whole of Britain during the entire Blitz. Malta survived, and the island was famously awarded the George Cross. My father was so traumatized by the bombing in Malta, and his reactions for survival were so great that when he got home, he would dive under a table if a car so much as backfired. My father also ruffled some very senior feathers by taking direct action to unload essential spares from 3 ships, Pampers, Talbot and Breckenshire, which had arrived on April the 23rd. After a very hazardous journey, he took it upon himself to use his RAF ground crew to unload the ships at night when there was low cloud and drizzle which prevented enemy activity, rather than wait for the Maltese stevedores the following morning. With ground crew working from dusk until dawn in the docks and at Lucca airfield, most of the aircraft spares were safely unloaded, and 18 Spitfires and Hurricanes were airworthy by the next morning. He was so appalled by the inactivity in unloading by the authorities that he eventually called the Governor, General Dobie, having exhausted all other channels, including Air Marshal Sir Hugh Pugh Lloyd. There were major rows and serious butt-passing, with letters being sent to the Prime Minister demanding the Governor's replacement as a result of my father's intervention. On the 23rd of April 1942, a picture of my father was printed in the Daily Sketch in a recruitment advertisement for the services under the title "For God, for England and St George." I have a copy here. He returned to the UK in July 1942 and had various HQ and training postings, and flew Spitfires for the first time. In July 1943, he was promoted to temporary wing commander. In January 1944, he was posted to 96 Squadron night fighters at Westmoreland, Kent, flying de Havilland Mosquitoes. At the time, Mosquitoes were amongst the fastest and most manoeuvrable aircraft in the world. In March 1944, he joined No. 29 Squadron, which was the first raised as a unit of the Royal Flying Corps in 1915, and is still in existence and one of the world's oldest fighter squadrons. He started flying with Flying Officer Stainton. Bob Stainton was a classicist and a Cambridge cricket blue, and became a great friend of the family and my godfather. After the war, he became headmaster of Glengore's Prep School near Battle in Sussex. My brother went there, and distinguished alumni include Field Marshal Lord Bramwell and the Dimbleby brothers. When they were overflying France, Bob Stainton gave a running commentary on the historical sites below, and kept my father amused by this. Such comments as "George, Amiens Cathedral, starboard 3 o'clock, wonderful example of Gothic building." He brought my father back down to earth. In May 1944, he was posted to command RAF Bradwell Bay, hence the reason for me being here today. He flew Spitfires over the North Weald of Kent, and then in July 1944, he was posted to command No. 29 Squadron again, Flying Mosquitoes. One entry in the logbook on August 13 suggests that his passenger was my grandfather, Colonel Powell. They were mainly overflying France in observation roles, as an entry on September the 17th states, defence of Arnhem airborne landings. In April 1945, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order as announced in the London Gazette, and we have the citation here, should you wish to read it in full. We have the transcript of a letter from Air Marshal Sir Roderick Hill, KC, Headquarters Fighter Command. Dear Paul Shedden, I'm delighted to see that you have now been awarded the DSO. This is a worthy climax to a versatile operational career which has been distinguished not only by steady and devoted service, but also by remarkable initiative in devising and putting into effect new methods of air defence and attack. Warmest congratulations, yours sincerely, Roderick Hill. Father was later awarded a bar to his DSO. The last wartime entry is Tour Around Germany in June 1945. After the war, my father had a number of postings and he flew many different types of aircraft, including Tudor, Hart, Atlas, Audax, Venture, Vincent, Oxford, Proctor, Prentice, Harvard, Mosquito, Wellington, Bomber, Martinet, Brigand, Hurricane, Spitfire, Anson, Auster, a lot. From 1951, he flew the first jet fighters, Meteor, Vampire and Sabre. In his career, he must have flown a huge number of different types of aircraft, ranging from biplanes held together almost with string to the first jet fighters. In later life, he was a hopeless passenger on civilian aircraft, as he was always mentally flying the plane. In September 1951, he was posted to command bases in Germany. I was old enough to remember these postings, and at Gütersloh I learnt to ride army horses, which would halt to German command. He went to Aalborg and then to command RAF Jever in December 1952. I learnt to sail on the Wilhelmshaven submarine pens. The sailing and the shooting still belonged to the British at this time. I also learnt to ski in Winterberg, one of the forces ski centres. He was clearly very well respected at Jever from references we have. He was promoted to group captain on January the 1st, 1954. We have a transcript of a letter from Air Marshal Sir Basil Embry. Dear George, I was delighted to see your name in the New Year's promotions list, and I send you my very sincere congratulations. I might add that your promotion was long overdue. However, you no doubt will pass through the other ranks of the RAF at lightning speed, with kind regards and best wishes. From 1954 to 1957, my father was posted to Naples as a senior British officer for NATO. He retired from the RAF on the 20th of March 1961. His leadership was always outstanding, but his stammer probably prevented him from reaching the highest ranks in the RAF. He was able to carry out briefings, but lecturing was a problem. Sadly, on leaving the RAF, he said, I just closed my office door and left the Air Ministry building. There was no send-off whatsoever. One of his extracurricular activities in the RAF was to take part in the 1948 Winter Olympics. There was a notice on the board asking for a heavy winter sportsman, and my father volunteered. At that time, he weighed in at over 17 stone and was ideal ballast in the four-man bob. They had a lot of fun and managed to finish 15th. The interest in bobsleigh has skipped a generation, and his two grandsons love it, and my son Richard goes every year. After his retirement, he devoted himself to the farm he had inherited from his uncle in Buckinghamshire, and he developed a successful career in the city as a stockbroker. He had a photographic memory and could read the share prices in the FT at a glance, which was very helpful as a stockbroker. He enjoyed life to the full and was a great host in spite of his stammer. He enjoyed all country pursuits and sailing. He had one of the early contessors at the Royal Lymington Yacht Club, which he shared with his brother. He sadly died on the 31st of October 1994, and the last post at his funeral was played by the RAF Bugler. Obituaries for him were published in the Daily Telegraph and the Times, and we have copies here today. To quote from his friend Anthony Dix, who had been very helpful with the preparation of these notes, and with whom my father worked over the retirement from the RAF, after retirement from the RAF. A friend of his told me that whatever the numbers of enemy aircraft, George was always ready to have a go. On very good information, I was told he had already actually been recommended, for the Victoria Cross. To quote from Anthony Dix again, "In his character and appearance was how I imagined Sir John Falstaff to have been. Whatever his faults, they were far outweighed by the qualities of intelligence, enthusiasm, courage, and the gift of leadership. He was truly one of the gentlemen of old England. He regarded the world as his oyster, and with his sword he opened it." Finally, I would like to read you the famous fighter pilot's poem by John Gillespie Magee, which many of you will know and which was read at my father's funeral. "Oh, I have slipped the sorely bounds of earth. I have slipped the sorely bounds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, I put out my hand and touched the face of God." I hope this has been of interest, and thank you for listening.
Oh, you shouldn't have done, Jean.
I've got one. We've tried to collect you a few things from Bradwell.
Oh, how
So
lovely.
even the sunflowers.
Oh, how lovely.
And
Absolutely
we
gorgeous.
totally
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much. That's lovely. I'm not professional, and this is just perfect. How wonderful.
Well, that's it. Thank you very
No,
much.
thank you. Thank
He sounds quite a remarkable man.
you. I think he was a fun person, and he enjoyed people and learning company and parties and beer.
Sounds like a Bradwell man. The reason he was here,
You explain.
he had a motorcycle accident whilst he was the squadron leader for 29
Squadron, yeah.
29 Squadron. Right, and he had a motorcycle accident which basically grounded him, not permanently, but short term. It was a very busy time in the for the whole of the forces, because there was a little matter of we were going back into the continent. It was the D-Day invasions, and he missed it. Well, that's a wrong term to use, because he didn't totally miss it. He was commanding a squadron, or commanding a air base that would have been quite involved. I know there were aircraft from here, Mosquitoes, etc., that was playing their part in the invasion. But I think he was must have been quite sad that he couldn't actually fly over there himself.
I'm sure.
It would have been a bit frustrating. However, he did recover. As you said earlier on, he had the capability of bouncing.
Yes.
So he crashed an aeroplane, smashed the motorbike up, but still survived and continued in the RAF for a number of years.
Oh, till
Till 61, yeah.
61.
61, right.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Angie.
Thank you. My
Excellent.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Right, one thing when I gave the briefing earlier on that I did forget to mention was we let you in, but to get out of here is another matter. Right. What you need, you know when you come in there was that barrier with traffic lights, etc. To get out, you need a token. The tokens are by the front door, the entrance that you came in. There's a little basket that's got tokens in. So you need to put one of those tokens to get out. So I'm not chasing you all out now though. I'm just saying that while I remember it because I've got a brain like a sieve. So yeah, don't forget to pick up a token to get out. Well, in the meantime, lunch will be, I believe, about 1 o'clock, Jean?
I don't know.
I bet.
I'll check.
Yeah, we'll just check. So in the meantime, what can you do to amuse yourselves? Well, although we're not right on the aerodrome here, there are bits of the early aerodrome, not far off the sea wall. I don't know whether you noticed when you were driving down here, there was like a tower thing, a watchtower. And lots of people say, oh, that's a bird watching tower, or that was a Coast Guard tower. It may have been used for those things, but that's not why it was built. It was built as a watchtower for the original firing and bombing range. In fact, there was 3 of those towers. Ministry of Defence in 1936 had bylaws, military bylaws that prevented people from walking along there when they were firing. You know, it sounded a bit unsafe to have members of the public walking along there when they were shooting the ground, etc. So they kept out. Was that right?
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock,
Yes,
brilliant.
yes.
Oh, well, that's going to give you a nice bit of time. You can walk up on the seawall. Also close to that is St Peter's Chapel, which was built in 654. 654 by St Ced. Was it St Ced? Oldest church in England?
Second eldest.
Second oldest. Which is the oldest then? I've got to ask the local historian.
It's certainly one of the cradles of Christianity, and it's built on the site of a Roman shore fort.
That's, yeah, that was the next thing. The
Founder.
yeah, there was on this site a Roman fort, and I believe that they had a bit of a dock here as well. But it was certainly a Roman shore fort, and it was called Athona. Many of the bricks from the fort of Athona and stonework are actually incorporated into the later chapel. Athona itself, this community, was started by an RAF chaplain. So we've still got RAF links here. The Reverend, is it Ralph Motley? You read.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think, I know his name was Motley. When it's been a vicar in the East End and the city, so he knew some quite influential people as well as working down the East End, where the proper people come from, don't they? And then he got into the RAF, and he used to hold open meetings where people would just sit there and chat and vent their frustrations, really. And they were open not just to, he was C of E, but his meetings were open to everybody, and was a good way of relieving people's stress. And after the war, he thought about it. He said these meetings should carry on, and he found this place, the back end of nowhere, in the lovely village of Bradwell, and he started the Athona community. I believe there's a second one now in Dorset. but this is where it all started from. And although it's not recognised in the write-ups, I believe what he would have been dealing with was post-traumatic stress. Not just from RAF people, from people who've been bombed. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, civilians that have been through the Blitz perhaps. So he opened up this community which, as you can see, is still flourishing today. And
did you say his daughter and his granddaughter still come?
I haven't got to that bit yet. No, fortunately, because they have allowed us, they've been really good to the Bradwell Bay Preservation Group, and we've got a display further down the road. When you come out of here and turn right and follow the pathway down, you'll come to a...
I'm monitoring, sorry, you can walk round that way as well.
All right, I'll lead you to be the guide. You stand this way.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll have our display open for you to go and read through it. I'll tell you a lot more of the history of RAF Bradwell Bay. So for the next almost an hour, have a wander around, have a look at our display, go up on the seawall, get a bit of fresh air, have a look at the St Peter's Chapel, and also, but look at the tower. Don't try and climb the tower. It's a little bit rickety now, but that was placed there in the 1930s. In fact, they were talking about putting a firing range out there in the mid-20s, and there was a lot of debate about that. But that's another lecture. But you can see the tower that's there, and St Peter's Chapel, and our exhibition. It'll take you 2 hours to read it all. So back here, 1 o'clock for lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, choose this to keep you upright, otherwise if I sit down I'll snore. Hope you're enjoying it so far and that you enjoyed your lunch. How many of you went down and saw our exhibition? Good. There's a St Stephen there. It took me all of 10 minutes to write that. Right, so well you can see what we're trying to do with Bradwell then, trying to pick up on a lot of human stories as well as the technical stuff. My friend Paul is much up on the technical stuff of aircraft because he rebuilds them and puts them all together. In fact, a lot of the aircraft that you see flying around are ones that we've worked on. The two-seater Spitfire owned by the Graysons. He works with them. Right, so session 3, the final conflict. I'm going to talk to you about our last commanding officer. And what I didn't realise when I planned this was how much of a barter connection there is. And that will come really apparent when you hear this talk. So we've had the barter connection with Powell Shedden, with him being in Barber's squadron. But Geoffrey Dalton Stevenson was even more closely friends and colleagues with Barder. So we'll start with the last commanding officer, Geoffrey Dalton Stevenson. I don't know who it is.
Oh, it's not clean.
With effects, eh?
Very clever. I like that. That's good.
So we're talking about Geoffrey Dalton Stevenson, 1910 to 1954. So he died when he was 44. So quite young, really. Born in Horncastle, Lincolnshire. And you can see the aircraft there is now restored and is flying from Duxford. You'll hear more of that story. Right, 1928. Two young lads went to the RAF College at Cranwell. You may have seen in the film Reach for the Sky. Right? Douglas Bader, the film's obviously about Douglas Bader, but how many of you have seen Reach for the Sky? At least I'm not getting who's Douglas. You can't remember it. Oh, well, at the beginning of the scene, Douglas Bader's flying along happily on his motorcycle going to Cranwell, and an aeroplane makes him look up, and he comes off his motorbike, and his bowler hat, didn't wear helmets those days, his bowler hat, which was on the front of the bike, got split, so he had this lid that sort of flapped up, and they get into the joining parade, and as Douglas Bader come to attention, he pushed the top of his bowler hat and it flew open again, and the sergeant who was leading the parade sort of went to tell him off, and the guy next to him, who in the film they called Sanderson, but in reality is this guy Stevenson, was laughing as well. So that there was a couple of characters, got that affinity together, and they started off in RAF College in the same intake and become firm friends. So that's the Gates. And the film, I've watched it in close detail over the last few months, and definitely the character they're calling Sanderson was Stevenson, because the careers follow. So you all know who that is? Do you know, anybody under 30s? Never heard of it? You've never heard of it?
I know who he is, I'm under.
Oh, you know who he is? Well, most people are talking to who's he? And you'll see what happened to him shortly. Right. Oh, there was that mark was a fly crawling across the legs. Okay, so that's passing out parade. What happened then? Bader and Stevenson got posted to the same squadron, 23 Squadron, based at Kenley, still flying biplanes, Bristol Bulldogs, Gamecock, etc. So they're both posted to 23 Squadron at Kenley. What happened to Bader? What happened to Bader at Kenley?
Had a crash.
Yeah, the crash, yeah. But his mate beat him to it. Stevenson crashed before Bader, but he walked away from it. Except the aeroplane didn't. The aeroplane caught fire. Right, so that was 14th of April 1931. Bader's crash is obviously more spectacular. This is a bit from the film. Don't take that as a first aid lesson as they just drag him out, because that wouldn't be correct procedures today. I'm an ex-first aid instructor. So, this is 23 Squadron operational record book. It says there, I've got this typed out better than the next slide. That says about Bader's crash, and then down here is what happened to Stevenson. If we go on these slides, it's a bit easier to read. So Bader was immediately posted to Uxbridge. supernumerary, non-effective, sick, as a result of a flying incident at Woodley Aerodrome near Reading. That was on the 14th of the 12th, 1931. I think this sounds so casual. Oh yeah, he's had a bit of a prang and has ended up in hospital. The guy very nearly lost his life. He had one leg amputated above the knee and one leg amputated below the knee. A long time to recover. He was visited a lot by Stevenson until Stevenson got posted from the 23 squad and got posted to number 1 armoured car unit in Iraq. The RAF were the ones that really run armoured cars, not the army. So he was sent off to Iraq. I tell you, looking at the next slide, they're all names that sound so familiar to us today. Isn't that very topical? So that's it. Right, there's your armoured car. And you see them back there, and aren't they names we hear sort of over the last year or more? Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Afghanistan, probably over there. So they're all topical names there, but we were out there in the 30s policing the units. So, posted to Iraq, and he was stayed in Iraq for about 3 years until March 35, when he got brought back to England and was an instructor at Bradwell. Not long before World War II, when we were flying Spitfires, Hurricanes, etc. But you can see there that biplanes were still in use. So it gets sent back to Blighty, 1935. Comes in an instructor at RAF College Cranwell. Not a flying instructor, it's a general instructor, which probably bored him to tears. He's a man of action, he's a flyer. So I don't think he was very happy at Cranwell. I'll just see. Imperial War Museum credits. In 1936 he had better luck. He was posted to the Central Flying School. Now the history of the Central Flying School goes back to the history of our air forces. In the lead up to the First World War, the air forces, we didn't have the RAF. Anybody know when the RAF was formed? The exact date? Sorry?
1902.
1918, yeah, a little more specific. I will be asking questions.
1st of April.
1st of April 1918.
Do you want the time?
Oh, yes. And what colour socks was administered at Bradwell? Yeah, so 1936, Central Flying School. Sorry. The Central Flying School was formed out of our air services. You had, initially it was all going to be Royal Flying Corps, Military Wing and Naval Wing. And you combine two different organisations together, doesn't work. So the Navy broke away from the Royal Flying Corps and formed the Royal Naval Air Service. They did that quite early on in 1914, but they still had one flying school, which was at Central Flying School, where they trained both sailors and soldiers to be airmen. Okay, so Central Flying School, initially based at Uphaven in Wiltshire from 1912, so long before the First World War, until 1946. So 10 years before it closed, Stevenson was based at Central Flying School.
That's the other great thing about commentating a show. You get to see what the real story from the
If anybody wants to go and fly in a Tiger Moth, come to our fabulous 40s day. This is a commercial break. Come to our fabulous 40s day on the 18th of April.
September.
September. I should have slept last night. Yeah, 18th of September, fabulous 40s day. There will be raffles and that going on. One of the prizes is going to be a flight in a Tiger Moth. Otherwise, if you're a member of Bradwell Bay Preservation Group, not a Facebook site, but an actual member of our preservation group, sometime in September we've got a day booked when for £175 you can go up to Alderley End and get a flight for £175, which I'm told is quite cheap. So, commercial break over. What's next? So, 1938, and it's quite an experience. He's been in the RAF for 10 years now. Stevenson becomes personal pilot to the Inspector General of the RAF. He's one of the top men. That was him. So he was basically he was his aerial chauffeur. The post only lasted to 1920, then from 1935 to the 60s. He was left in this post for just over a year until he went to join 19 Squadron, first as a supernumerary, basically a spare officer, but then became the squadron leader of 19 Squadron. And that's Sir Edward Ellington, who was the Inspector General for the Royal Air Force. So, goes to 19 Squadron, war's looming. They were flying Spitfires from Duxford. So, 1st of January 1940, takes command as the squadron leader. Now this is before the actual Battle of Britain, isn't it? Well, what's going to happen around this time, early in 1940? What was that?
Battle of France.
There's a Battle of France, and which led to Dunkirk. Stevenson went out to the beaches of Dunkirk flying his Spitfire. Although according to a lot of the soldiers, the RAF weren't there, were they? They all moaned about it, as you'll hear later on. But the reason was the RAF were further inland trying to stop the German fighters getting onto the beaches or getting around the beaches. So Douglas Sparder, who had managed to get back into the RAF, he convinced them that he could fly an aeroplane, and funny enough he got posted to originally 19 Squadron. So he was subordinate to his old college mate. Didn't stay there long because, as you heard earlier on, Douglas Bader was then given his own squadron, 242 squadron. I think the Reach for the Sky does demonstrate the state pilots were coming back in from the Battle of France. Douglas Bader takes over the squadron, mostly of Canadian flyers, and he told them off for being scruffy, not changing their clothes. But they said, this is all we got. So he managed to get them organised. So Bader was in 19th Squadron under Stevenson, then he got his own squadron at 242. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk is underway. Navy and the Royal Air Force are trying to save the Army. Obviously the Navy's more visible. Hopefully their boats didn't get above the cloud. But the RAF were sort of above the cloud and further back, so they weren't so visible.
But there was a victory inside this delivery, which should be noted. It was gained by the Air Force. Many of our soldiers coming back have not seen the Air Force at work. They saw only the bomber, which escaped its protective attack. They underrated the achievement. I've heard much talk of this, and that is why I go out of my way to say this. I will tell you about it. This was a great trial of strength between the British and German air forces. Can you conceive a greater objective for the Germans in the air than to make evacuation from these beaches impossible, and to sink all these ships which were displayed almost to the extent of thousands? Could there have been an objective of greater military importance and significance for the whole purpose of the war than this? They tried hard, and they were beaten back. They were frustrated in their task. We got the army away, and they have paid fourfold for any losses which they have inflicted. So when we consider how much greater would be our advantage in defending the air above this island against an overseas attack, I must say that I find in these facts a sure basis at which practical and reassuring thoughts may rest.
Of course, you know who that was speaking. He's actually coming to our fabulous 40s event. See the resemblance. Okay, but it is true the RAF were sort of denigrated, as I said before, but they were there. Right, so Stevenson, squadron leader, led a patrol out there. They met 21 Ju-87s, German aircraft, escorted by 30 ME-109s. They reckon that they shot down 10 EAs. What's an EA? Angry aircraft. Angry aircraft, yeah. But Stevenson and Pilot Officer Watson failed to return. And Flying Officer Ball was wounded in the head and the arm, but made it back. So what happened to Stevenson? I don't know whether he ran out of fuel or was shot down, but he landed on the beach. He did try to run for it, except he couldn't run fast enough, and he was caught. So that aircraft has been restored. It was there for up till 1990 something in the muds off Dunkirk. It has been recovered, restored, and is now flying from Duxford.
Did Paul work on that one?
I think he may have done some work on that because Paul's one of our committee members, and he did work at Duxford for a while. So I think it's quite likely that he did. And if he didn't, then he'll know a man that did, because he knows everything. Okay, so Stevenson was caught. What's the duty of every officer that's captured? To escape, to get out of it. And Stevenson made quite a lot of effort in getting away. And the Germans had a little place that they put all the naughty boys, the ones that tried to escape. Know that place? Colditz Castle.
My old school.
Your old school, is it? Another guy that got in there, which you've heard a fair bit about, was Douglas Bader, because he got shot down, and the only reason he got out of his aeroplane was by leaving his legs behind. His foot was trapped and he undid his legs and bailed out. That left him sort of fairly unable to run away, didn't it? So he was captured. The Germans offered to let the British drop his legs, a new set of legs off, and they offered him safe passage. The RAF decided not to do that. They did drop his legs off, but they did it on a bombing raid. So Douglas Bader got his legs. And now, having got his legs, what did he do? Try and escape a number of times. So where did he end up? Colditz Castle. Where, who's he going to meet up? Stevenson, his old mate. And you know, at Colditz Castle they were building a glider, which I have since proved would have worked, but that one never flew. And Stevenson, our last commander here, had worked on that. I'm not sure whether Douglas Bader worked on it. But there's a group of likely lads in the courtyard at Colditz, and let's see who we've got there. Stevenson is there. And Bader. So it's like friends reunited. They didn't get out of there, so they actually missed most of the war. They left RAF Bradwell White Bay to your dad. And yeah, they finally got liberated. And Stevenson eventually became the station commander at RAF Bradwell Bay, very near here. The airfield wasn't on this plot, it's a little bit further over that way. So yeah, Stevenson became the station commander here. Now, I was having a good time here. There were 4 pubs in the village, which kept them happy. There's only 3 now. And yeah, that's quite a lot for a village, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Douglas Bader, the only record we've got of him visiting was on the 14th of November when he visited in a Percival Proctor aircraft. That's a military light aircraft. And on the same day, 2 Meteor jets flew into Bradwell. And this is after the war's finished and the airfield is closing down. 24th of November, just a couple of days before the airfield shut down, 2 Dakotas carrying Dutch and Norwegian citizens were diverted to RAF Bradwell Bay. One of the reasons that we got aircraft flying into Bradwell was we had FIDO, that Stephen mentioned earlier on, Fog Intensive Dispersal Organisation, which lifted the fog off. One of only 15 aerodromes so equipped. So Bradwell was, although not officially designated as a reserve landing ground, quite often was used, and we had B-17s, Lancasters, all sorts flying in. So, RAF Bradwell Bay closed on the 30th of November 1945, but there's still a lot of buildings left, isn't there? How many blister hangars
Left.
Yeah,
5.
there's quite a few.
Yeah, 5, 6.
Yeah, quite a few blister hangars left. The control tower is still in existence. It's a private house, so if you ever wander round, don't go and stick your nose right up to the window, because I don't think the occupants will be very happy. There's a number of buildings around Bradwell that were requisitioned by the RAF. Downhall, which is near our memorial, was officers' accommodation, etc. But there was lots of buildings. Okay, but that's not the end of the story for Stevenson. He stayed in the Royal Air Force, as did a lot of pilots. Your dad stayed in. I'm sure a lot of people couldn't wait to get out, but so 1946, Geoffrey Dalton Stevenson, now he's married a girl from Burnham, but this is after the war, after he's left Bradwell Bay. He married Anne Jean Maureen Menzies, who was a widow, 25. When I first read it, I made the assumption that she'd married an airman. Totally wrong. She had married a Frenchman who came over here and got naturalised. I nearly said neutralised, maybe the same difference. But got naturalised as an Englishman and joined the army as in the Special Operations Executive. Stevenson married her in Burnham Church, Burnham Parish Church, and one of the signatories, I've got a copy of the marriage certificate, and one of the signatures as a witness was Douglas Bader. I haven't got any proof, but I would imagine, being that they'd known each other for so long, that Bader was probably the best man at the wedding. So, AJM Booth, that was her unmarried name, married Francis George Menzies, he's also known as Menison. Become a naturalised British citizen and fought for the British Special Operations Executive. Did a couple of missions out to France. On the second one he got caught and was executed just before the end of the war in a German concentration camp. They shot who they called spies rather than the gas chambers. And Menzies and Booth had a child between them, born in 1943, I think. I've got a picture of them. How did she meet a Frenchman who was an English Special Operations Executive? One of the organisations that sponsored the SOE was an organisation called FANY, which obviously sounds quite a funny name, stands for First Aid and Nursing Yeomanry. That organisation still exists today. It's a sort of quasi-military organisation, so it still exists, but they work quite closely as a front for the Special Operations Executive. So the Fannings have been doing a lot of the admin, so that's how they got together. And they did have a daughter, and that's Menison. Just show you that because it gives a little bit of a background to the wedding. Anne Booth, or Maureen as she preferred to be called, was actually the daughter of, I think, was it Sir James he was part of the iron foundry works in Burnham. Anyway, so that's that little bit of background. He went off to the Central Flying School. And I just remembered what I was going to look up last night and obviously forgot to. 1946, he became the commandant, the boss of the flying school at Little Rissington. So the Central Flying School had now moved in 1946 to Gloucestershire. Usually flying meteors and things like that. And there is a story about the Little Rissington UFO incident, which is what I was going to look up last night and forgot to. Must have fallen asleep. But it's worth looking up on the internet. After that, Geoffrey Jordan Stevenson, ADC. What's ADC? Not ACDC. Aide de Camp, that's it. First of all to the King, and then when the King died, he became the ADC to Queen Elizabeth II. So he's getting up in high circles. Yeah. Then he went off to America, headed a 6-man team from the Central Flying Establishment, and he had a fatal accident. Flying a Super Savior.
The first prototype flew for the first time in May 1953, followed by the second prototype and the first production model in October. The F-100 was found to have superior performance, but had some design issues. The aircraft could develop a sudden yaw and roll, which would happen too fast for the pilot to correct and would quickly overstress the aircraft structure to disintegration. Another issue, nicknamed the Sabre Dance, stemmed from handling characteristics of the swept wing at high angles of attack. As the aircraft approached stall speeds, loss of lift on the tips of the wings caused a violent pitch up. At low altitudes there was insufficient time to recover. The F-100A entered U.S. Air Force service in September 1954. By November, it had suffered 6 major accidents, due to flight instability, as well as structural and hydraulic system failures. All F-100As were grounded until February 1955, and due to the problem with this model the Air Force began phasing out the F-100A in 1958.
No, that was it. So that's the type of aircraft. Stevenson was one of the 6 fatal accidents. Nosedived into the ground. It was a stability thing, and that's why he died so young. Long-term career, probably would have made Marshal of the Air Force. Memorial at the American Air Base, Eglin Base Chapel, 10th of November 1954. Air Vice Marshal came over. British policy then was to bury people where they died and not to bring them home, which is why you got the massive war graves out in France from the First World War. So he was buried in America. He'd had, I think, 2 or 3 children by then. Yeah. Still got the Commonwealth War Graves grave out there. And that's a picture of his actual grave. I didn't take that. Not been out to America, well, not that part anyway. So, any questions on Geoffrey Stevenson or anything about Bradwell Bay? Because if you've got any questions, it's like I'll refer them to Stephen.
In the film Dunkirk,
Yeah.
Tom Hardy, there's a scene in it where he flies over the beach and runs out of fuel, I assume.
Right.
Lands, and seeing that picture there, it looks very similar to the film.
Yeah.
Is that anything connection or?
I'm not actually sure because he wouldn't have been the only Spitfire that came down on the beach.
Mm.
But it may well be that they got the records because Stevenson's story would have been more well known and would have shown up on a research.
No, just seeing that picture there reminded me of the
I've had exactly the same thought. I thought, well, that looks very similar.
Yeah. But in the film, he sets it like with a flare gun, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't. Well, no, he didn't do that. Go back to
That one there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does look very similar. I don't think he actually set it afire.
No, but I mean in the film he did.
In the film, yeah.
I just wonder if they used a bit of poetic license seeing that and
Quite possible.
put
I
that in
mean,
the film.
in all the films that
Yeah.
don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
Which is quite common. I mean, the same with Reach for the Sky. It's
Yeah.
there's a lot of poetic license, but it basically tells the right story. So, but if you look at it that way, Stevenson's done quite well out of films. Reach for the Sky and Dunkirk. Unfortunately, he wasn't around to fly the back in Britain because he was already in the clutches of the Germans.
Have you been in touch with his children at all?
I've tried, I've emailed them because I did see a couple of the children was on the telly, and I've emailed the company that they'd gone to see their father's Spitfire, the one, well that one, taking off from Duxford. I've emailed the company who were involved, and I've tried emailing them directly and got no response at all. But that's,
So they haven't done an Angela for you then?
no. I wouldn't be doing this talk then, they'd be doing the talk on their day. But you see what I mean, there's the close links between both, and that's brought by
You might even have been an instructor of her father at Bradwell.
Could well have been, yeah, because he was at Cranwell a couple of years later
A
on.
couple of years later, yes.
So they probably did meet.
I'm sure they would have met.
And they sound very similar sort of, they were
Some of some characters.
similar, yeah, likely lads. Any other questions? I thought you put your hand up there, Jean.
No.
No?
Thank you
Okay.
very well.
Very interesting, thank you.
Thank you.
So, are you happy with what you've heard today? As long as you've got your money's worth, as it were. Thank you for attending. If you have got any problems with catering or anything, come and have a word with me. To say I haven't done those evaluation forms. I thought about it and thought about not because you might write nasty things. Yeah, you would have done, wouldn't you? So, thank you for attending. I would suggest on your way home that you go and have a look at our memorial. How many of you have not seen the memorial? Right.
Just one quick question for them.
Oh.
The actual reason they closed the place was it just they just didn't need it anymore.
Yeah, the war was over.
Yeah.
But so much of it survived. Even with building a nuclear power station, the threat is now with the Bradwell B is that there won't be anything left. They'll dig up the runways. They had actually said about knocking down the control tower, so the whole lot will be flattened. But it's not going to happen, is it? Is it, Jean? No. Thank you, Linda. You look quite determined there.
Oh, I'm very determined it's not going to happen.
Good.
My dead body.
Yeah, one question on that is that they closed Bradwell Bay because it wasn't required, but you've got places like Manston that survive, but they're similarly far east. Is it just the fact that Manston's a little bit closer to Dunkirk, or?
I don't think
they had that same fault system, didn't they? It's basically the big flamethrowers.
Yeah, I think Manston had that. Manston was actually built as an emergency landing ground, which meant it had slightly wider runways, and they also had longer runways.
So it's about 2 miles, and so that's actually where I'm from, that neck of the woods.
Right.
It's basically down the bottom from where I live. And my dad tells stories of when the Americans were there with the Super Sailors, and he used to fly them off 4 abreast down the width of the runway.
Yeah, because it was that bit wider. And it was actually held as an emergency landing ground for civilian aircraft until, within my lifetime.
Very, very recently.
Yeah. And I believe the Royal Air Force Fire Training School, is it still there? Right. So most of the runways still there.
Yeah, not an awful lot left of it, to be fair.
Isn't it?
Nature's starting to take hold a little bit, and it was recently resurfaced because they were using it as the car park for when they were putting all the lorry drivers through the whole COVID
of course, yeah.
No, it's amazing how quick they're closing, because I used to live at a place called Silver Inn, and literally half a mile from my back garden was Bradwell, which was a big place. And we used to go up there for a bike ride, and it was hard, unlike Bradwell, it was hard to believe that it was a big World War II era. This is in the 70s, you know. So, and from what I read about it, basically they just give it to the farmer and let him do what he liked. You know? Yeah. And over time it just grown over.
Yeah.
You had visions of great big bulldozers coming in and digging everything up, and they just walked away, didn't they?
Yeah, they'd leave it as they have at Bradwell. And some of the runway is still visible. In fact, we've been debating whether there's enough runway left to land a small aircraft. Just for our 1940 show, it's actually not quite enough. But places. The best place to see old aerodromes is not from the ground, up there. But you agree with that, Stephen? You've flown over quite a few of them. And I know when I was trying to learn to fly, you could spot an old aerodrome for miles. Drive down there, you wouldn't see much of it from up in the sky.
So it was mooted, Eric, after the war that they might keep it going as an aerodrome. And if some of you remember the Foulness debacle, Bradwell was being mooted as an alternative to Foulness at one point, as an air base, as an airport. And it didn't happen, of course. But when Bradwell A was being built, aircraft landed on the site. And as far as the buildings go, even in my lifetime, and Gene can confirm this, a number of buildings have disappeared in more recent years. There were many more outbuildings that survived the war that were then demolished in the 60s, 70s and into the 80s. The Astra Cinema was still here for quite a long while.
Really?
Yeah, and slowly all demolished.
Yeah, because Bradwell Bay had its own cinema. They initially used to show films in the NAFI, but then they built their own cinema, and local people were allowed to attend the cinema. Mind you, living in Bradwell Village, probably 2 times as many service people as there were villagers, so it was a bit overwhelmed. They had to go through a checkpoint to get into the village, which kind of ruled out a lot of them having family visiting. Well, why don't you come down for Christmas? Yeah, but we've got to fill in 14 forms in triplicate to get you a pass to get through here. It was quite tight security. And it was all 3 services were here. The Army was here providing security and anti-aircraft fire. The RAF Regiment also providing anti-aircraft fire. And I believe the Navy had a presence here, although their main high-speed launch was at Brightlingsea, which is nearer to Colchester. Something else went through my head about Bradwell.
Eric, can I just ask about the shooting range? Because I can remember back in the early 70s they still had the targets over there. So I was just wondering when they actually stopped using that.
I think they probably stopped by the 70s.
Yeah, I think they probably had, but I was wondering when they actually had.
I think it was early 60s.
50s, 60s. So it went into the jet age, and there's a real story about the range, as you've said earlier on. Meteor crashes there, F-84 crashes, quite a few incidents post-war on the range.
Well, see, the American Air Base at Wethersfield was using the range quite a lot here. But of course they didn't need the landing strip anymore because jets, you know, come from Wethersfield to here, a few minutes. And before, to get a light bomber out here would have been a massive flight for them, so they had to pick up fuel and bombs at the original airfield, which was still running to the 1940s. It was like a satellite of Hornchurch and Northfield at different times. And when invasion was, they really thought it was going to happen, they got a load of old dumped cars and spread them around the runway so that the Germans couldn't land on it. I don't think they did that to our concrete runways, which, as Stephen said earlier on, opened in 1942, although the commanders and Met officers and ground staff were actually moving in from late 1941. So accommodation was there, but the airfield wasn't quite ready. Any more questions? Or are you dying to get out that door?
Got any idea how many wrecks there might be still out there?
I don't know, to be honest. That's something, it's going to take quite a time to research everything. Research that's currently going on is the operational record book for Bradwell Base. So Fighter Command would have their own ORBS, operational record book, and then individual stations would have an operational record book. I've got most of the record books for RAF Bradwell Bay. I've got a lot of the squadrons as well, because the squadron would have their own record books, which you can download for free. As I told Paul, you had a relative that was in the RAF?
Grandpa.
Yeah. Your grandpa, yeah. Well, I gave Paul details of how he could get all the records without moving off his backside. Doesn't have to go down the archives for that one. But yeah, the station operational record books you can't get online, but I've been down the queue, photographed them all. Trouble is with photographs, some you could tell when the ribbon was running out on the typewriter because the printing was getting softer and softer, and to take a photograph of it, it's amazing that anything comes out at all. But I've got somebody who's actually transcribing them into a Word document, which is going to make it so much easier. Because how fascinating things. I know the person that's transcribing it has only done, I think she's done 40 and 41, and keeps saying to me, I'm getting sidetracked by all this because there's so many stories to tell. But having them transcribed will make it easier for us to really write things up.
I was wondering what he could find if he went magnet fishing off Bradwell.
I don't know.
That might be a bit dangerous.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll leave that to you. I'm too young to die. But no, that's all part of it I would call aviation archaeology. My particular forte is archival records. So I like to keep my feet dry and go into archives and get those sort of details. But they work together, don't they?
Mm.
So you could identify things from operational record books.
It might be some people nutty enough to want to do that.
Well, yeah. I think
That's
most.
as it was a range, it must have bombs and things like that.
Yeah, I think most of them have been cleared up. The Navy came along, was it in the 70s sometime?
So it was a real graveyard at one point, but the Naval Bomb Disposal Unit initially came out with a hovercraft, would you believe?
Yeah, I've got photographs of
Were
that.
blowing wrecks up. But on really, really low tides, you could see all sorts of stuff. I got a 303 off of a 303 Browning off of a Boston out on the flats. And there was loads of stuff, but they've slowly blown it up and cleared it. The problem with aviation archaeology nowadays is that you need MOD approval to touch any sites.
And they're quite...
they don't give permission usually.
There's also, we know of a mosquito that's in a farm quite near there, and the farmer is adamant that he doesn't want it dug up. Mostly because he's heard stories. They did recover some of the crew from it, but in old ambulance service parlance, it was a plastic bag job. You know, they were picking up bits and pieces of the air crew, and in the aeroplane gradually sunk in the ground, and it's still there, and the farmer will not allow any digging. And even if he allowed it, as Stephen says, you've got to get Ministry of Defence permission, which is unlikely to happen.
Talking war graves then, really, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. So I think quite rightly so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let sleeping dogs lie, as they say.
Eric, during the war, when they were
God, you sound just like Uncle Albert.
keeping these operational records, what was the actual purpose of keeping operational records?
I don't know. I wasn't there.
No. It was quite a task, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, but then if you think about it, even in the First World War, there were operational records kept. There were for Stomaris.
Yeah.
Lots of records kept, you know, which I researched quite a lot of them. Probably,
I suppose they thought that 100 years later, people
oh, but yeah, I don't think they were thinking ahead. It was, I think it was more to do with accountability. You know, what did we do with our time? What did we do with all this equipment you gave us? So I think it was a lot of accountability. But of course it is useful for us historians today. Did you ever?
Yeah, it is kind of, as you say, it's always like an accountability thing, but also a learn from error type of things. Where it's like the I don't know if anyone's ever seen the original bomb disposal manuals from the EOD.
Don't think I've seen that.
It's wonderful. It's things like flying officer logs, for example, approaches the device, describes the device, looks at the panel so and so, unscrews this screw first. Flight Lieutenant Jenkins approaches some device, does not do that screw, does the other screw. Then another person comes along. So literally these manuals are written because they track what each individual person has done.
Yeah.
So if they don't die, it goes on to the next bit they're doing. That's basically how they did the manuals. And the flight operations manuals are
a lot of those
idea.
manuals are available at the National Archives in Kew.
I think as well, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't in the RAF, but I think it's like in the railway, it was just a culture thing until we got privatised. In the railway, whatever you done, you wrote it down in triplicate, and there was some department that you put them 3 copies in, and they just kept them, they never threw them away.
Just filed them away.
And if you got the Railway Museum in York, for instance, there's records there of what time they had a cup of tea when they took the Flying Scotsman up, you know, how they drank the tea, and they just kept it, they wouldn't throw anything away.
Yeah. With archives, a lot of things have been thrown away. There are records from the First World War held by the RAF Museum in Hendon that will give a lot of information about medical conditions in flying. The RAF Museum, even though everybody is dead, won't allow them to be used. I knew exactly the reference number. The lady from the Air Historical Branch went to RAF Museum. I mean, she was working for the Ministry of Defence and really struggled to get them to allow her to see them. And when I tried using her name as she told me to, no way, you can't see them. And I don't know why, but you know, those sort of records would have been quite important in researching and, as you say, learning from things. In the First World War, they kept battalion war diaries, didn't they? Which are useful to read back on now and learn lessons from what they were doing wrong and what they were doing right.
There wouldn't be much in them, though, would there? For the Italians. It's a joke.
I wasn't on the Italian side. Not much Italian in me. One of my great uncles, who would have had Italian blood in him, served out in France, and I've read his battalion war diaries. And I've also read the battalion war diaries from anybody heard of the Battle of Neri? Battle of Neri was, we're digressing a lot from the RAF now. Now, Battle of Neri was around the 1st of September 1914, and the British Army and L Battery Royal Horse Artillery had found a nice place to bunk down for the night, give the horses some water and all that sort of thing. And the Germans, although they didn't know it, was a little bit up the hill. The cavalry sent out a patrol and said, if you see anything, don't do anything. So one jumpy little cavalryman saw a German helmet and goes bang, which told the Germans that they were there, and in the end L Battery almost got annihilated. They were right down to the last gun and the last bit of ammunition, and then reinforcements come in and drove the Germans back. But that's all well recorded. There's even books written about it. My interest in that is a cousin 3 or 4 times removed was a battery sergeant major, survived. In fact, he was the one that kept the gun going. The captain of the battery didn't have a leg to stand on, literally, and he eventually died. But my cousin and another sergeant that stayed with him both got the VC for that. So, but it's all recorded, so I can tell exactly what happened. So there's a lot of value in the records. There's a lot of value for us nowadays, but it was also being written down to learn what's right and what's wrong.
I think as well, it's a lot to do with the regiments. I don't know if you've ever been to the Guards Museum, but my family were in the Irish Guards. When you go in there, they'll let you see anything. You tell them, you've got to have their rank and number, what battalion I was in, and they'll let you go out there and if they got it.
With the battalion war diaries, it's mostly officers that get mentioned. Not very often, and that's in all the services. The lower ranks don't get a mention. They were there, but we just use them for target practice from the other side. But officers, your dad included, would have been part of the crowd that would get mentioned. Okay, we've gone all full circle round to First World War battles. That's probably why I'm interested in it, because knowing of my cousin's victory, and the first thing you do when you walk into the Imperial War Museum now is cannon. It's the first thing you see. I'm quite proud of that. And they've got his VC upstairs. So I've also got another relative who was a deserter from 1916 onwards. He was continually trying to get out, but he wasn't a natural soldier. So I'll go from deserter to VC. Well, he didn't want to get as far as going to the battle. Got conscripted, he'd take to training camp, went home, go home and get him.
Really?
Okay, well, thank you all for attending. I'm sure you're all flagging a bit now, aren't you?
Nonsense.
Well, it's getting a bit warm in here. Please
Thank
keep
you,
in
Eric.
touch with
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you. You know what, I didn't plan for the last session anyway. Shouldn't have said that phrase, any questions. But no, I quite enjoyed it actually. Yeah, you've been out to our exhibition. We're open there Saturdays and Sundays from 12 till 4. We've got a fabulous 40s day, I've mentioned it a couple of times. You'll see it on our Facebook site. Looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. If you want a drink, come by train because there will be a bus to take from Southminster to the event. Lots of things going on. That should be good. And if you like a good old sing-song, 1940s song, will be the place for it. How many of you are members of the Bradwell Bay Preservation Group? Not so much the website, the Facebook group. Are any of you actual members?
Not yet, no. We will be.
You will
We've
be.
only just moved here, so...
Oh right, oh join. Have you got all the details?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, because we've got, there's some leaflets
Yeah, I've
there.
got one of those. Thank you very much.
One of the advantages, you may see it as a disadvantage, is you being a member, is that the last Thursday of every month we have a club night. It's all done on Zoom at the moment. We are hosting occasional proper meetings, but I think that'll just be a booze up. So I was trying to think of a polite word. But yeah, we have these Zoom meetings, and it's mostly we have a talk. We can have a bit of a chat as well amongst each other. I was on a Zoom meeting a couple of months ago, and it was getting on like 11:30 at night. Oh my God! But I was talking to somebody who was a Radio Essex DJ who also is a member. So yeah, this month, which will be this week sometime, there will be a talk on the Special Operations Executive. Most of them are sort of directly related to Bradwell, but this one's going to be on the SOE, which, as you saw from this, tenuous links to Bradwell. Okay, you can go now. Thank you very much.